You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to the Proof Text podcast, an offshoot of Glossa House Publishers, where we put out lots of biblical language materials, some theological and practical materials, and here recently a book that I and a friend co-authored on classical Christian education. So we're excited to have you, Dr. Blomberg. I particularly am excited because I ran across your book recently online. I just started a doctoral program, and it looks like I'll be doing research on the Gospel of John. And I saw your book, and I thought, oh, that would be a great talking point. So thank you. Why don't we start this way? Well, let me introduce you, and then I'll ask you a personal question, and then we'll jump right into your book. I'll just read straight from the Denver Seminary website. Dr. Craig Blomberg joined the faculty. He is Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Denver Seminary in Colorado. He joined the faculty of Denver Seminary in 1986. He is Denver Seminary Professor Emeritus of New Testament. Dr. Blomberg completed his PhD in New Testament, specializing in the parables and the writings of Luke Acts at Aberdeen. He received his MA from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and a BA from Augustana College. Before joining the faculty of Denver Seminary, he taught at Palm Beach Atlantic College and was a research fellow in Cambridge, England with Tyndale House. He's published a wide variety of books. Most of the scholars, pastors, and students that I interact with know you most for your book on the Gospels, Jesus and the Gospels, an Introduction and Survey, and the survey from Acts to Revelation, from Pentecost to Patmos, and especially your book on the parables. I actually came in contact with you first back when I was in college. I had just become a Christian, and I was 19 years old, and we had a summer book study, and there were 3 or 4 studies I could have selected in our small little church. And one of them was on money and wealth. And I said, well, you know what? I'm a Christian. I've got to think about how to use money in a different way now, and I really want to do that right. And so I attended this book study, and we read through your book, and I remember being really influenced by that. It was a great service to my young mind and heart at the time. And so we are here to discuss Dr. Blomberg's recent book, Jesus the Purifier, the Fourth Gospel and the Fourth Quest for the Historical Jesus, published by Grand Baker in 2023, just going on a couple years now. First, I've got a personal question for you. Tell me, if you can, in a succinct way, the story of how you became interested in biblical studies, in particular New Testament studies. What's your journey into that?
I was raised in a church-going family, but I really consider my conversion to date to my getting involved with a Campus Life Youth for Christ Club in college, and then being nurtured by them and by a Campus Crusade for Christ chapter. Sorry, I should have said Campus Life in my high school and Crusade in college. And both groups encouraged kids to be active in sharing their faith. And I found out as I did, especially at an undergraduate academic environment where people were abreast of what critical scholarship to some degree was saying about Jesus, that I might say, well, Jesus taught such and such on that topic. And I would get the response, well, of course, modern scholars are convinced that Jesus never said that. And I didn't have an answer. And so I started looking for one, and realized that, yes, some modern scholars believed that, less conservative ones, but there were others that none of my professors ever talked about, who were putting out good arguments for believing that Jesus said and did these things. And there weren't a lot of people in that camp, but the more I looked into it, the more I thought, this is something I want to pursue further.
So it seems it was right off the bat deeply personal and relates really to what you've just recently written. What did you study in your undergrad?
I was the butt of many jokes because in those days, the school I went to did not have minors. They only had majors, and it was possible to get a major in a field with, I think it was something like 36 quarter hours, so 9 4-hour classes, and a lot of people had a double major. I was able to bring in some AP credits, so I actually had a triple major in things that everybody laughed at that said didn't go together, which was math, religion, and Spanish. And so my friend said, yeah, he's going to go to Mexico and teach math to monks, but I never actually did that.
Oh, that's fascinating. Interesting. Yes, I majored in one degree, in my undergraduate degree, and I've got quite eclectic background. I don't get made fun of, but my undergraduate degree is in music education. I grew up ranching as a cowboy, more or less, and rodeoing a little bit. I specialize in trumpet, and then when I became a Christian, I said, I don't think I want a musical career. Pretty good at trumpet. Made the top wind ensemble at the university my first freshman year. Played in Carnegie Hall. Had a wonderful experience. Learned a lot of great things, and then went off to seminary up in Minnesota, and fell in love with the Bible even more. Fell in love with the languages, and now what am I doing? I'm getting a PhD in biblical studies and teaching middle school students Shakespeare.
How about
So
that?
yeah, so the Lord brings us from and to many places we may not expect. Real curious though, before we get started, have you found that your time with your studies in math and your studies in Spanish in particular have influenced in any way your academic journey?
Immensely. The logic that's required for math and science has enabled me to very easily understand philosophical arguments, linguistic arguments, even just practical things as a teacher. I've been suspicious of digital computation of grades and been able, by just working things out by hand, to see how mistakes were made and tell the people that programmed the grading thing that they were wrong, and fortunately help students get better grades as a result. Spanish, I have had a number of opportunities over the years, both outside and inside of the country, to do some teaching in Spanish. I'm not as fluent as I would like to be, especially once you get outside of the vocabulary that you would use for teaching the Bible. I would be hopeless at trying to explain to a mechanic what was wrong with my car, or deal with the terms for construction or specialized topics like that. But I can get by, and so that has been a blessing as well.
Yeah. I did a pastoral internship for my last semester of my seminary course time in our Hispanic ministry, and I'm pretty comfortable with listening to a sermon in Spanish or listening to the religious Spanish radio, but you put me on the streets and there's a lot of vocabulary I just don't know.
And some of it you might not want to know.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Okay. So you've just written a new book, a year and a half, couple years ago, Jesus the Purifier, the fourth gospel, and the fourth quest for the historical Jesus. In the book, you walk the reader through the first three stages of this quest. You show some strengths and weaknesses and some reasons that led from one quest to the next. And then you propose a fourth quest, but you really just say the quest has already been started and I'm just continuing it on as it relates to the Gospel of John. So let me begin with this question, because the book deals with the historicity of the Gospels and the historicity of the figure of Jesus. Let me just ask this simple question: why is it important for Christians to consider the historicity of the Gospels as a why is it important to believe that the Gospels themselves are historically reliable and not just, on the one hand, either fiction, like a myth, or inaccurate, whether or not purposefully, depictions of this figure, Jesus?
I am grateful when I meet people, usually in churches, who have been faithful believers, sometimes for years, and this has never been a big deal for them. But if I get a chance to talk to them about it, normally these would not be people who have spent a significant amount of time online discovering the whole gamut of approaches to reacting to Christianity, reacting to Jesus. They probably have not spent a lot of time talking about their faith with people who do not share it, do not share anything like their own beliefs. And when you enter into the marketplace of ideas in our world, whether by talking to people directly or on all the ways you can communicate online, you suddenly discover huge numbers of people deconstructing their Christian faith, if they had one once, or changing their form of faith, or even more commonly, people who have never had Christian faith, and over again, they question the reliability of Scripture in general. They question the reliability of the Gospels, because they recognize that just about, with a handful of exceptions, just about all that we know about Jesus comes from the New Testament Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if those turn out to be largely unreliable sources, then at best we can know very little about who Jesus was, if he was at all like what churches historically have claimed. And at worst, maybe he is an entirely made-up character, and therefore the salvation that we talk about, that we cherish, that we offer to others is also a myth that is not really available.
Is it? It seems very comparable to Paul's statement at the end of 1 Corinthians about the historical reliability of the resurrection. Right. If he didn't resurrect, then we're a people to be most pitied. We have a vain religion. It's meaningless. That's good. So, tell us about the main thesis of your book, and to whom you're writing, and what you're trying to accomplish in that.
The various quests or various phases of the so-called scholarly quest for the historical Jesus have, for the most part, almost since the 1830s down to the present, so going on just about 2 centuries now, have said if we're going to find that which is trustworthy, historically speaking, about Jesus, we will find it in the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which, if you read them, are more like each other than different. And then when you turn to John, you discover that he is much more unlike them than like them. And so, whereas a man 200 years ago, a famous philosopher named Friedrich Schleiermacher, who also wrote about Jesus, could say that John was the most historical, and you had to figure out how to fit in the other 3 into his narrative. Virtually no one has done that ever since. And their conclusion is that with maybe just a handful of exceptions, the details that are unique to John cannot be trusted. There have been outliers at each phase along the way that have not gotten much traction in the larger scholarly world. But during my lifetime, those outliers started appearing a bit more frequently. And in 2002, so not even 25 years ago, a man from George Fox University, Paul Anderson, had his proposal for a new seminar as part of the Society of Biblical Literature, a huge multi-thousand member collection of scholars that meets annually at different places around the country. His application approved for a new seminar called John, Jesus, and History. And if you were trained at one of many major institutions around the world in biblical studies, that would sound to you like an oxymoron. John, yes, John has a portrait of Jesus, but historical? No, for the most part. Now, 23 years on, as the seminar has continued to meet and produced 4 large volumes of essays with at least 2 more in the works, and spawned other writers, both inside and outside of the seminar, to write articles and books. There is a definite trend to say there's a lot more in the Gospel of John that we should, by the standard canons of historical research, accept as true. Little by little, Anderson, in his own writings, would cautiously say, perhaps it's time to talk about a 4th quest. And then in the last 10 years or so, he's been saying, we need to admit a 4th quest is underway that gives John parity, by which he means equal right to be heard, equal right to be examined, same criteria used, doesn't prejudge the results of that study. Maybe John will continue to be somewhat less trusted than the other 3. Maybe he will turn out someday to be more trusted, but we're not going to prejudge that matter until we do our historical study. And he himself is working on a very large book, which I hope he doesn't keep postponing and manages to finish, because it could be quite a groundbreaking work.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, summarize for me the first 3 stages of this quest. Where did it start? This first quest to find the historical Jesus. Well, actually, maybe be helpful to just back up a second. What do we even mean by historical Jesus? Because whenever I'm thinking of lay people in my church and in churches that I've been in. Well, of course, Jesus was historical. Like, what's the big deal? Why are we having such a big fuss about it? So, what is the historical Jesus research?
It's easier to say when the first quest ended than when it began, because the very term was coined by a remarkable young German at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, Albert Schweitzer. Schweitzer became better known as he went on to live a long life into his 90s, and in the 1950s gained the Nobel Peace Prize for medical missionary work in French West Africa, which today would be in the country of Gabon. But as a young man, he was a concert organist, and he did a double PhD in psychiatry and in New Testament studies. In his biblical studies work, he compiled and summarized and critiqued quite literally dozens of studies, most of them in German, not quite all, and created this title, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. In the 19th century, there were some forerunners even slightly before that. What the term meant was, what happens if we do not start out and presuppose traditional Christian dogma and convictions about Jesus? What if we function simply as historians of any ancient figure, ancient religious movement, or other development, which, of course, meant that different people would come at that question different ways, just as historians don't all follow the identical approaches in doing their work. But what people were agreed on was, we're not simply going to say, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it for me. I assume that this is a true collection of statements, and I go from there. As a result, there were quite a lot of varied pictures of Jesus, sometimes susceptible to the critique that they eliminated from the outset that which they could not imagine, most notably the most miraculous or supernatural elements. They often seemed to emphasize things in the Gospels that fit their own philosophical or ideological schools of thought, whether rationalist or focusing on mythical, legendary material, or the movement known as Romanticism. Schweitzer critiqued all of these, saying if there was one thing that could be established about Jesus that had to be a key starting point, it was that, like others in the Jewish world of his day, Jesus believed that God was going to intervene. Apocalyptic was a big word for him. He was going to dramatically intervene in the affairs of human history and bring about a messianic age, bring about a change for the better in the nature of this world, prior to what Scripture talks about recreating heavens and earth. And from our perspective as historians, we can only say that in that area, Jesus was a failure, because it didn't happen. It didn't occur. What he thought would happen during his lifetime didn't, and he came to the conviction that he had to die, an atoning death for the sins of the world. And that would bring about the interruption, the supernatural inbreaking of the kingdom of God. Today, 100+ years later, scholars say, well, Schweitzer obsessed on one aspect of the kingdom of God, details that we would say are still future, that have yet to happen. And because they didn't happen immediately, Schweitzer's view has problems. We would say that Jesus inaugurated the kingdom. He didn't bring it in all of its fullness. But that's language of the 20th century. That's not language of Schweitzer. He wound up saying the quest for the historical Jesus had been a failure, just as Jesus himself had been a failure in that one respect. But the Spirit of Jesus can still lead people to do great things, and in the mystical union that Paul talked about of being in Christ, which is what he went on to write about in later decades, you can find your meaning for life, and Schweitzer did it, and he went off to the jungles of Africa to do it.
And so Schweitzer was operating from a Christian perspective? Whenever you say the Spirit of Jesus continues on or lives on, what's he meaning there?
Certainly, he would have said he was a Christian. It is very difficult from the handful of things in his writings to pin him down on Jesus' resurrection. But a majority of people who have been interested in trying seem to conclude that he did not view a complete, fully bodily resurrected Jesus as part of his faith, but he certainly believed that, I chose my words deliberately, the Spirit of Jesus lived on, and that was a very real, divine reality that Christians could link up with and rely on for guidance in their life and salvation in the future.
Yeah, and so he marks the end of the first quest, roughly around
1906.
Right, early 20th century. And then the second quest, when does it begin, and what's distinct from it and Schweitzer?
Schweitzer was convincing to enough people that there was a tailing off of that kind of study of Jesus, but other things, including 2 world wars, including blatant anti-Semitism in the study of Jesus and the Gospels, also took its toll. A man by the name of Rudolf Bultmann, another German who lived into his 90s and probably from the late teens up until the early 1970s was just a dominant figure in German New Testament scholarship and in other parts of the world derivatively. Bultmann was a classic existentialist. He didn't look for what the future might hold, but what God spiritually was telling people to do and be today. And so, yes, there was not another distinct phase until a number of his former graduate students after the war, after the Second War, in the early 1950s, gathered at a reunion. They had all gone to the University of Marburg, where Bultmann taught, and began to talk about what they called a new quest of the historical Jesus that could focus on criteria, try to come up with an agreed-on method, much more than the people that Schweitzer all lumped together from the 19th century had done, that could avoid at least the most blatant forms of anti-Semitism, that recognized that whatever else Jesus was about, he came preaching the kingdom of God, which was partly present, but also partly deferred to the future. Parables were central to his method and to his message. He certainly came into conflict with the Jewish leaders of his day. What exactly provoked and became the last straw was debated, but there was an attempt to say, can we come up with some reasonably agreed on consensus? Different people would want to add things, but at least here's the bare minimum that we can say as historians we can know about Jesus and we can move forward with.
Yeah, he was a part of the confessing church. Is that correct?
Bultmann was, as were
Yes.
several of the people like Ernst Käsemann and
Yes.
Hans Konzelmann, who were part
Yep.
of this renewed quest.
But Kittel of the big theological dictionary, he was quite the opposite. And
He was
vocal
very
about it.
pro-Nazi at one point, yes. Fortunately, it's not as easy to do damage to the meanings of words when you're anti-Semitic than it is to do damage to your understanding of an entire person. But
Yeah.
there are things in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament that people have pointed out that should probably be revised.
Yeah. So, second quest picks up and is initiated in broad terms with Bultmann, and then
with his followers, really, more
with
than
his followers.
Yeah.
Okay, and then this third wave of searching for who this historical figure that we know as that we call Jesus, who he was. When did that begin?
Again, it's not like there was a newspaper article or a town crier that said, we've laid to rest the second quest, we're starting the third. There were precursors in the 70s, but a lot of people would say a man by the name of E.P. Sanders, who in the 70s had started something that came to be called the New Perspective on Paul, in 1985 published a book called Jesus and Judaism, and among other things pointed out that even the new quest, now we have to call it the second if there's going to be a third one, was not nearly so blatantly, but in many more subtle ways, still highlighting a Jesus who, while Jewish, was different from any other known Jew of his day. And Sanders and then others after him became convinced that those differences had been exaggerated, partly because it hasn't been until the last generation or so that we have had in English and in other modern languages a complete translation of all of the ancient encyclopedic-sized Jewish literature, and recognize that Judaism was much more diverse than some of our simplistic sweeping generalizations are. But if there's one thing that has unified the third quest, it has been, we want a Jesus who is very credibly Jewish as Judaism existed in the land of Israel at the beginning of the first century. It also has been a period that has relied on a lot of interdisciplinary investigation, studying sociological backgrounds, the nature of the economics of the Roman Empire and how much that played a factor, how much of Jesus' message was covertly anti-empire. It has been a period that has said criteria can be useful, but we need to go beyond that. And it's not just that we identify 70 verses that are the most likely to be the real Jesus and then try to put them together and see what happens. But we need to come up with a narrative that makes sense of everything we see in the Gospels. We need to talk about his aims, his ideas, his plans, not in an overly psychologizing way that some people in the 19th century did that gave a bad name to that, but simply from what is left, what was Jesus about? What were his intentions? And nobody has stopped any of that today when we start talking about a fourth quest. It's just that the third quest still was very tied to Matthew, Mark, and Luke with very little from John.
So with each of these phases, if you will, the primary documents from which they're building their arguments are the first three Gospels, the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and to a large extent...
Matthew, Mark, and Luke, yeah.
Oh, yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There we go. That's three. And to a large extent, the fourth Gospel is either neglected altogether as unhistorical or not treated to the same level of historical reliability. Why is that? Why is that?
It's different. If you're on one of these, I'm going to read the Bible straight through in a year plans, so that you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke back to back to back, and then you read John right away again, you'll go, "Whoa, is this the same guy? What's going on here?"
Yeah, it seems to be common in scholarship now to believe that John was the last gospel to be written, and so it seems on that basis that it's different and it's later, which seems to suggest that the three that are earlier, that are really similar to one another, different but really similar, they have really what's historically reliable in them. And so, and your book, let's get specific with your book because it digs into the Gospel of John, its historical reliability, and jumps into the stream of this fourth quest. What in particular about John's Gospel is, well, let me frame it this way. What are the major pieces of the Gospel that your book works with, pushing forward this fourth quest in the historical Jesus?
Had I been 30 years younger, I might have been tempted to try to come up with some grand synthesis of all the different pieces of John that different writers have been saying, maybe we ought to trust this and maybe we ought to trust that. But I was not so ambitious, and so I took one topic, one of the criteria that you still hear people talk about, that historians use around the world in lots of different contexts, where you're trying to figure out what today we would say real news from fake news, is when you recognize that an author, a writer, a speaker has an agenda. We all have agendas, has certain issues, convictions that they're trying to convince other people of. And as a result, they keep recurring repeatedly. If you come across other things, if we're talking about historical or biographical narrative, and you come across details that seem to cut against the grain, that go, what some people have said, against the tendencies of the tradition, then there's a reason to ask, could these have been important enough that the writer, the speaker, felt they needed to be included, even though they weren't part of, or maybe even mitigated against that person's agenda in some way? So I took the Gospel of John. I had written a book 20 years ago called The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel, where I simply, in commentary fashion, went through passage by passage and said, using the existing criteria, what can we do with each passage that might show something has a chance of being historical. Very much aware of the main themes of John's Gospel, the kinds of things you would get in a book on the theology of John, major emphases, certainly a high view of who Jesus was, all kinds of titles, the famous I am sayings of Jesus, a sense about eschatology, about end times, much more focused on what has already begun now in the present, not the same apocalyptic sense that you get in the synoptics. So here's a list, long list, a dozen or more things that most people would say these are John's big emphases.
Okay.
Go through each passage, highlight those, bracket them. Is there anything left? Well, yeah, there always is. There are always details that don't necessarily fit in. Do that throughout the whole gospel, and then go back to the parts that are left and ask, now, do I see any patterns? Do I see things that I didn't see before because they weren't so prominent compared to the big issues John is concerned with? But now that I've set those to one side, is there something that keeps coming up in a smaller way? And one way, maybe the most common thing I saw, was issues of purity. Water functioning in baptism, in symbolic ways, in Jesus' own language and teaching, issues about the coming of the Spirit to do what water itself couldn't do or symbolize. And in the first half of the gospel, particularly the first a little more than half, 12 or 13 chapters out of 21, almost every chapter, sometimes every half chapter, has a story where the issue of purity, beginning with the distinctively Jewish emphasis on ritual purity, plays a significant role. What is it that may or may not be sinful, but renders you ritually unclean by the laws of Leviticus, like touching a corpse, like having some unusual bodily emission, like having mold in your house, like having a defiling skin disease? We don't go around living our lives thinking about these things. We don't encounter them that much. And if we do, we don't think of them as affecting us in the same way. But
often in modern day terms, we tend to embrace those things. If there's mold on the wall, we tend to lean into that mold and scrub it away ourselves.
That's
get
right.
our hands dirty. It's like the opposite.
That's right. Get rid of it as soon as possible, and don't worry about having a priest come to check it and confirm that it's gone, and then having a quick baptism to make sure that I'm ritually pure again. So Jesus seems to be on a mission to wean people away from this emphasis on ritual purity to a much more important emphasis on moral purity. Look in the textbooks on John, and some of them don't even have a entry in either the table of contents or their topical indexes under purity, but it keeps coming up. Then ask the question, well, is this really just something bizarre, and maybe I should reject it because it's another one of those things only in John? Go back to the synoptics, and while the illustrations are different, you have some very striking passages, like after Jesus has shown he can heal people in all different ways and is about to show that he can pronounce somebody clean who's not even within sight, but at another home, he goes out of his way to touch a leper when he heals him, beginning in Matthew 8, and thereby incurs, no, wait a minute, he doesn't incur ritual uncleanness. What about the woman with the 12-year flow of blood, who, if I just touch the edge of his garment, oh my gosh, how did his bodyguards let the woman get so close and defile him? But no, power goes out from him, and she is clean, and he realizes something has happened and makes a public example of her. It's completely the reverse. It's what some authors have called contagious holiness as opposed to contagious impurity. Well, that's really the same thing. Is that a huge issue in books on the synoptics? Not always, sometimes not at all. So now we have something appearing in both the synoptics and John. It's not obvious one of the big topics, if you're going to narrow things down to emphases. It derives from a practice that Jesus was trying to help people move away from, obsession with ritual purity. Maybe there's more to pay attention to there than scholars or ordinary Christians typically have, especially when you ask, so in today's world, does the average evangelical Christian think more about how Christians' holiness and goodness could do good and bring healing and wholeness and salvation to very bad people and corrupt situations? Or do we think more about how we dare not let them corrupt us, which is why we have to go on campaigns to remove the filth from at least our neighborhoods or our communities, even while not necessarily noticing that it's right in our own churches, and often in the leadership. Which then brings us to 1 Corinthians 5, when Paul said, I wrote to you, not telling you to worry about the outsiders, but the insiders, but that goes way beyond John.
That's wonderful. A contagious holiness, that's the antithesis of the contagious defiling that you see in various contexts in the Old Testament law. I've never made the connection between ritual impurity and the impurity that many, unfortunately, Christians put forth as a result of people who are different than them coming into their sphere of living, even into their own church. That's wonderful. That's what I love most about Christian scholarship. Scholarship that is written by Christ-exalting, Bible-believing believers is that when it's done well, it's no less critical than the non-believing scholars. It's right up there, but yet you can the pastoral heart and the ease with which the scholar can go from the critical methods to the the practical use of what we're writing and talking about in the Christian life is it captivates my heart. And so I really appreciated your book in that regard. I think it does it very, very well. You right at the beginning, let me just pull it up if I can do it real quickly. Right at the end of your introduction, I may not be able to do it real fast, but you basically say something like, yeah, I'm too far in. Strap on, put on your thinking cap, and hang on for the ride. But it's mingled with this personal tone that is stay in there, because at the end it's going to be worth it. It's going to be it's heavy sledding at first, walking through these first 3 and eventually 4 phases of the historical quest for the quest for the historical Jesus. But then at the end, you really, I think, do a great job of pretty much what you just said right now.
You might be thinking on Roman numeral page 21 before we get to the Arabic numbers, put on your analytical thinking caps.
Yes.
Be ready to be stretched by new ideas, whether on the ideological left, right, or even center. Reject every hackneyed caricature or criticism of those you might naturally disagree with, and see what there is to learn from each of the 4 quests for the historical Jesus. And if the proposal for a way forward that the second half of the volume offers doesn't satisfy, please don't just carp, but propose a still more excellent way.
Yeah, it was great. We're just about out of time. So when I originally saw your book and I reached out to you and you agreed to come on the Glossa House show with me, I said, "Oh, I got to get my hands on this book fast." I said I didn't have a hard copy, and so I went to Amazon, and for some reason Amazon was sold out. And I said, "Oh, well, I've got this Barnes & Noble gift card that a student gave me for Christmas." So I went to Barnes & Noble. It's all sold out. I couldn't find one that could get me a copy in at least a week. And I wanted to, and so I forget where I downloaded it from. I purchased it, and I was thinking that when I purchased it, they were giving me a PDF, but they gave me a what do you call this application, an EPUB version, which is fine, but it doesn't have the page numbers that I want to cite. And so after reading it on this inferior version, I'm definitely going to buy a hard copy. I couldn't recommend it enough. I thought it was wonderful.
Did you actually try Baker Books themselves? It might have been slightly more expensive, but
that would have been the most logical thing to do. Order it from the publisher.
We get in our ruts. The normal way doesn't work. We forget about options.
Yeah, I guess I could have just reached out to the publisher. So one last question. So it's really obvious why scholars should read your book, because it's proposing to continue this 4th quest, looking particularly at this one motif. Why should, let's just say, I don't know, a Christian who wants to know about these matters, who is willing to get through the weightier section of the historical unraveling of the quest, why should laypersons or how could laypersons benefit from what you're proposing?
I tried to aim for a balance between enough detail that there was something a bit new that you wouldn't get in other people who have quickly tried to summarize the quests, but to also keep it short enough that you could read it and did it chronologically, tried to bring out connections between people and phases and eras, and that would be interesting, and that you would get without having to wade through a giant tome entirely devoted to the topic. You would quickly get up to speed on what people have been saying. And I doubt that there's a single scholar that I cited or surveyed or a movement that does not have lasting impact on today's world. You may not know it because you don't associate a particular view on a particular topic with this person, but once you study it, you realize, oh, that's where that came from. If you're not at all interested in that background, then skip to the second half. And I think I still have enough there just to help understanding the Gospel of John to make it worthwhile.
Yep. Yeah, I think so too. Dr. Blomberg, thanks for being so generous to take an hour out of your Friday afternoon to come chat with me about your book. Jesus, the Purifier, the fourth gospel, and the fourth quest for the historical. Jesus, it's been out for a year and a half, 2 years now. Go out and grab it if you're listening to this. So, Dr. Blomberg, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.